Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
Thank you all for listening and for joining us here today. I am very happy to introduce my guest for today, Ivy Bromius. Ivy is a professional project manager with many years of experience in the corporate world. She is also a diviner, an author, a coach, and an all-around very excellent witch. She's written several extremely helpful works, which she offers on her website. That website is circlethrice.com. Those include a magical lunation rite, works on agile project management and planning, witchcraft, and a lot more. Through her work with clients and her writings on her site, she helps people figure out where they want to go, what tools they need to get there, and how best to plan and navigate. Her most recent work, which we'll be talking about here today, is the Cancer Grimoire, which was born of some very hard-won, unfortunately, very hard-won knowledge, but it is an incredible work, and I am honored to be able to speak with her about it here today. So welcome, Ivy, and thank you for being on the show. I have been looking forward to this quite a bit.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I wanted to just start out by introducing you. I mean, some people who are listening will know your work very, very well, and some will be hearing about you for the first time. And usually what we do on the podcast is I will ask people their background with divination, since that's such an important part of this podcast, or what their family background was with magic and divination. And I think you have an interesting set of circumstances and family history around divination and magic. So maybe you could share a little bit of that.
Yeah, so I first became interested in divination really in my early teens, and I ran across a book. At the time, tarot decks weren't something you could just kind of go by, right? So at the time I was reading with like a standard playing card deck, and I was very into it. And I eventually found my way to my first deck and began reading the cards. And it was only like decades later, talking with my mother, that I realized, she said, "Oh, your grandmother did that." And I never met my grandmother because she passed away when my mother was only still a young woman. And no, she read with a tarot deck and told fortunes. And she told my fortune when I was young, before she died, she said. And that she told me I would, travel across the water, and I would have 2 daughters, and told her the whole thing. So I have this interesting family history of reading the cards, but that I wasn't even aware of until I was older. So that's really wonderful, because I've currently incorporated that ancestral lineage into my readings. So when I read cards for people, I call on my grandmother to watch over the reading and make sure I'm reading accurately. And so it's kind of a wonderful it was a real inroad to me into divination, because I am a late child, and that means that many of my relatives have passed, and I don't have as much of an immediate connection. Say, I never managed to meet my grandmother or my grandfather on my mother's side, for example.
Mm-hmm. And that connection to divination was something that you developed. Was it something that the moment you discovered that deck of cards, it became something you were fascinated with, or did you kind of experiment and put it away for a while, or has it basically been something that's important to you from that point on, would you say?
So I originally what happened was I found a book in the library when I was, 11 or 12, which was like Pictorial Key to the Tarot, it's a Budge or something. It's a very sort of hermetic Golden Dawn style thing. And it's actually a really annoying book, because it's all like the secret history, which I cannot divulge to you, ha ha ha. But it had photos of the Waite-Smith deck, right, which was the deck, right, at the time that was kind of most common. And it had photos of the deck, and I was obsessed with them. And of course, I didn't have a deck, and I didn't know where to get a deck. And I'm in this small kind of town, and there's no shop to get a deck from. So I just started taking the information from the book and using it to read with like a regular playing card deck. And I didn't have any of the trumps except, of course, the Fool. So I read a lot of Fool-based trump readings, I guess. And then a few years later, I had run across a book by Whitley Strieber, of all people, who he wrote about this essentially a fiction book about a coven of witches. And the book is called Cat Magic. And I ran across it very early, I was like 13, 14. And it had the address of Circle Wicca in it. And like literally the hard copy address, because this is long enough ago so that there was no internet and there was, it was so much harder than to get information, right? To find what you need to find. And I actually wrote them a letter, like a snail mail letter, and sent it off. It's a very fangirly kind of thing, because I read the book and I was like, oh, yes, this is it. This is what I've been needing to find. This is like the information that there's a gap. I needed this. And they sent me, a catalog, and they sent me all the stuff. And from there, I ordered my first a very yellow Waite-Smith deck, and, books, and really started getting into it.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, because we're going to talk about so many other things, very weighty, magical things. But for tarot, what do you still use? What are your go-to decks? I'm just curious.
So I've been a kind of like a deck serial monogamist for a really long time. So that Waite-Smith deck was my deck for some years. And then when I got to, especially like my early years, being a teen, reading for my friends and stuff. And then when I got to college, I got the Eclectic Tarot, which has got, it's got beautiful trumps, and then it has non-representational pips, and it's got this very weird kind of Eastern Hermeticism like underlayment. It's got the most beautiful death card ever, but it's an almost impossible deck to use because the cards are like cardboard, and like the deck is like this thick, so you can't shuffle. You have to do like this go fish kind of style. You can't even certainly you can't riffle shuffle, but you can't even slide shuffle. It's like this chunks of card, and it's beautiful. And I read with that for a number of years, and I still have that deck. Unfortunately, I don't have the my earliest Rider Smith's deck, because I don't know, I've lost a card, and then I was very young and melodramatic, and so I burned the deck. It was very kind of like, I'm burning the rest of this. I should have kept it, because it's kind of would be awesome to have. I still have my Eclectic Tarot. I use it for magic now, because some of the cards are very beautiful, and they work well on altarpieces, or that kind of style of magical divination where you put the reading you want and set it out and work magic off of it, which I love. And now I have the Gilded Tarot, and I've had the Gilded Tarot for probably 15 years or more now, which I like. It's got a little bit of a steampunk vibe. The images are beautiful. They're more representational. And that's my kind of modern tarot kind of background. I also have Marseille style decks. And then recently I've been there was a point at which it's like I always had one deck and I used it sequentially. Like even my old deck that I still have, I never read with it. And then I bought a second deck, and all of a sudden the floodgates opened, and now I just have tons, and I can't stop. And it's like,
yes, no, I understand. Believe me, I do understand that. So before we dive into the grimoire that you've put out there in the world, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it is that you do, both professionally for magical oriented people such as myself, and in the corporate world as well. You are a project manager, and you help people with that. And your website has an enormous number of wonderful resources for that. But can you talk to us just a little bit about what your background is with that combination of magic and project management?
So I've been reading the cards since I was like a preteen, and I've been doing magic. Well, I've been doing weird stuff since I was very little, but like I certainly found my way to like magical supplies and magical books in again, sort of in my mid to late teens. So I've been doing that for a really long time. And then I ended up with kind of a corporate day job, eventually becoming a project manager. So as a project manager, kind of in my day job world, I managed, I help coordinate teams of people who are working on, say, for example, software projects. And so my area of corporate expertise is in software and hardware development, right? So I work in that computer world. And so I have a certification in it, and I have kind of a lot of experience in it now. And at some point, some years back, it occurred to me that there was this really useful kind of synergy between project management tools, which is all about appropriate goal setting and task breakdowns and prioritization and risk mitigation, and magic. And that those two things dovetailed very nicely into this extremely useful kind of body of knowledge that you can use to reach your goals and make magic work for you. And in looking around at what I was seeing kind of out there in the magical world, which of course at this point is very internet oriented, no more writing snail mail letters to places across the country and getting a catalog. Now you can just go online and find all this data and information. And, there's a ton of amazing magical folks who are like dreaming great dreams and trying to manifest kind of a better, more enchanted world. And I'm really supportive of that. But nobody was kind of like combining it with the more practical, how do you actually set a goal that's achievable? How do you actually get stuff done every day in an organized way, but using magic, right? And so that's why I started kind of Circle Thrice about 2016 or so. And at first it was just a blog, and I was just sort of putting my stuff out there, like, there's all these places where, there's this combination of things. Like literally the official term for kicking off a new project in the corporate world is project initiation. And so there's just all these great kind of, just combinations that you can use to, really get stuff done, but also make a more magical life, right? Which fascinated me. So I started blogging, then I started doing readings for people, and then I actually started consulting with people. So, companies pay me money to manage their projects, but people can do the same, right? You could work with someone like me to figure out how to articulate your goals better, how to integrate that with magic, how to be more agile in your project planning. So I have some free booklets, I have a mailing list. It's a standard kind of good stuff that folks have. I have a monthly membership where I put out a magical planner, it's a planner, right? Because I'm all about the planning, but it's also all astrological magic, right? So I'm not an astrologer, don't play one on TV, but I'm very fascinated in how you can use magic to take advantage of or mitigate against various astrological conditions.
Yeah, and that ability to take what essentially so many people in the magical community are, very gifted at various skills, perhaps, but being able to put those together into a cohesive plan can be challenging for people. And there are so many directions that we could go in with that, which means that I just have to have you back on the podcast another time to talk about that, I hope. But I wanted to kind of just turn slightly. There was a quote that you had in one of your documents. I can't remember which one it was. It might have been the risky business one. But the quote that I wanted to read to you was, first, let's get past the magical elephant in the room. Thinking about bad things happening will not make them happen, and blandly thinking about good things won't make them happen either. I know this sounds completely contradictory to a lot of current pagan and new age thinking. So this is, as a part of your document, you're talking about, ways of planning and thinking about things. And we are going to talk about the Cancer Grimoire and what happened to you and how you reframed that for yourself. But I wanted to just kind of see if you could just elaborate a little bit on that concept of positivity or negativity and how you view that conversation.
Yeah, no, and that's such a great quote. And yes, that you're right. That comes out of an old blog post that ended up in a booklet that I did called the Risky Business Booklet, which is all about risk mitigation and crisis planning and all of that. So if your life is on fire, go to my website and get the booklet. It's free, right? And it talks a lot about this. And I think that the context of that is that if you say, oh gosh, if I think about something bad, that something bad is going to come happen to me, that's actually not correct. Now, there is such a thing as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you go around thinking everyone's mad at you, and so you're angry and grumpy at everyone for being mad at you, then guess what's going to happen? They're going to be mad at you. So that sort of stuff happens psychologically. It also happens magically, right? If you go looking for trouble, sometimes the universe gives you the trouble you're looking for. So certainly our actions and our thoughts have resonance in the universe around us. So I'm not saying that that's not true, but where I'm coming from is the idea that if you are secretly worried about losing your job because you're a paycheck away from just losing your place to live and it's all feeling very stressful and you're just going to never think about it. Well, if you never contemplate the risks, then you're never going to be able to make a plan to mitigate them. Mm-hmm. And maybe get ahead of situations before they come on fire. Because whether you think about something bad or not, sometimes bad stuff just happens.
Yes.
Right. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether you were thinking or not. And in terms of thinking good things, certainly having a positive attitude and being optimistic is an incredibly powerful, magical tool. But sitting around imagining that you're lying on your private island while, like, I don't know, oiled buff serving guys fan you with palm leaves and feed you grapes or whatever it is, that doesn't actually get you closer to manifesting it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. You have to couple that with actually doing things that'll help bring your goals closer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that statement very interesting because I've spoken to some people who have said that they practice magic, but they don't actually practice divination because they're afraid of manifesting something bad if they happen to get a negative card or something of that nature. And I was thinking of that quote, which was, obviously I think of divination as information gathering, so it's a different thing, but there is sometimes that, like, well, if I don't think about it, or if I don't draw the cards and I don't, if I never draw the tower, then maybe I won't manifest the tower. But we're
at the cusp of this conversation and this sort of context around this we're at the cusp of this sort of we're at this place where we're on the border of some really correct magical ways of thinking and some really incorrect ones. So, for example, thinking that the universe is kind of a good place and that good things can happen to people is generally results in better life outcomes. Like research shows optimism is good for you. At the same time, you really risk getting into victim blaming here. Yes. Right? Yeah. If thinking that everything was fine made everything fine, then there would be a hell of a lot more fine out in the world, instead of lots of people getting the short stick or unfair results or systemically oppressed. And we risk denying that those troubles are out there by just saying, well, la, 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 everything is groovy. At the same time, if you're cognizant that there are rough things that happen, but instead you take the tact that a little foreknowledge can arm you against them, that seems much more magically proactive. If a car is coming down the road to hit me, I would rather know it's coming so I could have a hope of dodging, rather than thinking that looking for traffic means I'm going to manifest traffic. Yes. Divination is no different than that. It's just a little more obscure. It's a little more occulted, right? If you look ahead, and divination is actually great at giving you shit news. It's one of the secrets of tarot. If you say, tell me everything's going to be groovy, you're not going to get good readings. If you say, okay, tell me what the problem here is, then the deck will step up. But it's just the way forecasting seems to work, right? We seem to have an easier time getting the bad news. So I think of that as a good thing, a positive, because then you can do things to mitigate.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to, speaking about positivity and mindsets and what happens and how there are many things that we that are very tough things that can also happen. I wanted to invite you, if you could just talk to us a little bit about the Cancer Grimoire and how that came about, and what your journey to writing that was, just in whatever way you want to share, at least the beginnings of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2020 wasn't the best year for a whole lot of people, right? So certainly I wasn't alone in feeling like, well, that was not the most fun year ever. But for me, it was a particularly tough year because early in the year, in the third week of March, when the lockdowns were just occurring, particularly in the United States, and everything was locking down, and there was a lot of fear and a lot of like nobody knew what was going on, but everything was getting shut down, and it was really scary. I had pulled a rib muscle, in part because I was just very tense, because it was a very tense time. I think a lot of people were feeling that. And in part because we were packing to move house. We were going to put our house on the market and move over for that side of town. And so I pulled like a rib, and about 2 days later, there was kind of a painful lump kind of here. And So I went to the chiropractor, as one does, right? I'm like, this isn't going away. A hot bath didn't help. And the chiropractor was like, well, I've adjusted your rib. You're fine. Yeah, you just got a little pulled muscle here, but this doesn't seem okay. Maybe you should have this checked out. And I had it checked out, and I had stage 2 breast cancer. And I spent basically a year in treatment dealing with the cancer. And so on top of everything else that happened to everybody in 2020, I had cancer treatment and I moved house. So that all still happened somehow in the midst of all of this. And I got through it, and I just had my first post-treatment scan, and I'm fine, no signs of cancer. Yes. And I plan to stay that way, putting that out there. But I decided early on that I was going to try to deal with this situation in a magical, deliberate way, in addition to a medical way, right? So like, certainly when you get a diagnosis like this, there's a whole lot of people who are like very, like these oncologists or whatever, are very invested in getting you, figuring out what to do and getting you treatment, right? And then with me, especially, they moved very quickly, which I appreciated because my tumor was extremely aggressive. But I also wanted to deal with it magically. And after I'd gotten through all of it, I realized that there was a lot of really interesting things that had happened through that process. And I wrote it all down in this Cancer Grimoire, because fundamentally, and this comes back to, sometimes bad stuff just happens and you can't, you can't stop that, right? Sometimes shit just happens, but also the way you approach it and your attitudes about it do make a difference. And so I was looking at this as a kind of initiatory experience for me. It was obviously challenging, and I wanted to leverage magic to get through it as well as I could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an incredible offering that I think really is an important thing to get out into the world, because it kind of harkens back a little bit to what you were just saying about the previous question about positivity and all of that. Because one of the things that I've had conversations with sort of like some of my non-magic friends is that victim blaming thing always comes up. Oh, they say, well, all this new age positivity then doesn't leave room for, what are you saying? Are you saying that people that have bad things happen to them want it to happen, or they're not spiritual enough, or, anything of that nature? But there's a lot more forces in play. And while it's wonderful to partner with our medical system, which for all of its problems does have enormous things that it does extremely well to help people, but having that context that then is a wider, magical context, can have so many other tools open up for people. I'm going to stop for 1 second and just say that neither Ivy nor myself are doctors. We are not medical professionals in any way, shape, or form. I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV. And therefore, you should not get medical advice from me or from Ivy. And therefore, You can speak to medical professionals for those things. That being said, we can continue.
Yeah, we just the standard CYA disclaimer. But in fact, the Cancer Grimoire isn't medical advice, interestingly, right? It's magical advice. And so I think that's the position I'm coming from, is that regardless of the medical choices that you make for yourself when you have a diagnosis, there are things you can do magically that'll improve your results, but also just your process. There's plenty of people who they go down this path and have cancer and they don't come back. They take the final turning and they go on to something new, right? They die. But even if that happens, magic can help make the process better, which is crazy, right? Like, just as it's a benefit regardless. And it can potentially help you kind of get through it, which is kind of where I came through it, right? So yeah, this isn't medical advice. And in fact, you can't give medical, this is when you get cancer, this is the whole, well, if you only thought better thoughts, you wouldn't have gotten cancer. Well, that sounds nice. That's great. Thanks. People do have advice, and some of that advice is a little bit, now I always took all advice in sort of the spirit of like the love and the caring, in which it was given. Advice is sort of my love language. If you call me and you've got a problem, I don't want to commiserate. I want to give you advice. So I get it. But the truth is that regardless of why this happened to me, and there's some speculation in the grimoire about some of the things that could have sort of contributed to it, some of which are things like, interestingly, just months before I got diagnosed, there was some research that came out that showed that permanent hair dye actually increases your risk of exactly the kind of breast cancer I got. I have been coloring my hair for decades. So there's stuff like that where you can be like, oh, that might have contributed. There's also kind of emotional things where, having some strong emotions that you're not, comfortable or able to process can land in your body in a way that increases your risk of, weakens your immune system, let's say, increases your risk of becoming ill. That's not a blame thing. That's not like saying I wasn't positive enough. I didn't think the good thoughts enough to avoid this. That's not really a useful way of approaching this. At the same time, when you get a diagnosis, it's easy to feel bad and despair. And it's better to approach it optimistically and proactively as much as you can, because you get better results that way. You get better practical results and you get better emotional results, because it just doesn't suck quite as bad if you can keep that good mindset.
Yeah. So when you got this diagnosis, which I cannot imagine because I have not experienced that, when you first received that diagnosis, and you were processing that, what were some of the first ways, outside of obviously, getting the best team of doctors, I'm sure, or, getting advice from people that you trusted on this, from a medical perspective, what were some of the things that you immediately just came to that you wanted to start doing, or that you reached out for help in some ways for?
Well, first of all, we know that for all the techniques that these doctors and oncologists have that can assist with dealing with cancer, the medical system as a whole is pretty messed up. I don't think we're going to pretend that that's all, especially in the US, right? So certainly magical targets around making sure you get good doctors, because it's not always your choice, right? Like there's, we don't always just get to pick, right? We're not millionaires. We get what we get, and we hope that it's decent based on where you live and nearby availability of medical professionals, and also the insurance you have, because again, messed up system, right, to start with. So magical targets around that are really smart, and that's one of the things I landed on. But the most immediate thing I wanted to do is I wanted to reach out to other magical people and ask for help. And that's normally not my style. I'm kind of more independent. I don't like to ask people for help. I'd rather not need help ever, right? But it clearly struck me that I needed help. And so I reached out to, so I'm a member of RuneSoup, and I reached out to those folks, and they stepped up in a major way for me. And they conducted a series, like a global series of these kind of intention, power of intention meetings, groups for my healing. And I can't thank them enough for doing that. I really feel like that makes a difference. I collected prayers from everybody. For if people were a little bit like, is it okay if I pray for, because people can be skittish. I'm like, no, bring it on. Shower me with all the prayers. I got prayers from every kind of faith and creed and every kind of magic, and it was amazing. And it felt so great. And part of me putting this grimoire out there for free, like not even, sign up for my thing and you get, like, really, this will never not be free. It's for free, and it's released under Creative Commons for non-commercial purposes. So anyone can take this, add to it, make changes, pass it on to anyone they know who needs it forever. Because that's kind of my thank you to all those folks who stepped up to send me those good prayers and magic and good intentions.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. I just want to, intention magic has been mentioned on this podcast before, because we've had other guests on that have talked about it. And just to refresh, if people are wondering what that is, it's based on Lynn McTaggart's work in The Power of Eight. And there is, in RuneSoup, there's a number of different groups that are based kind of geographically, so we can meet at appropriate times. And I'm in the EST group, and there's different groups that meet for various purposes, to help people with everything, not just health things, but with all sorts of different goals and things like that. And it's incredible magic. But I think, yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that also speaks to the importance of community and being open to accepting help from many different places, which I know for myself, I also tend to be sometimes very much an introvert, and I will want to just kind of like hole up. And I think that is one response that people can have when they're under stress or in very difficult conditions, is to just kind of like isolate. And you did not do that. And I think that's a wonderful thing to share, that like reaching out for help that's appropriate, that's actually going to help you, not like just putting things out there that might end up being too much for you, or mean that you're, sort of burdening yourself with lots of people talking at you, if that's not going to be helpful for you. But having that sense of community, I think, is important. Yeah. And with that being said, so you were reaching out and receiving prayers and receiving intentions from many different locations, and you were doing some magical targeting to make sure that you received like the best possible care in our US healthcare system. When you had a very long process, I mean, it was a year, correct? In terms of this. So did you find that your practice changed a lot over time, or was it kind of like how you started, you kind of had already in mind what types of magic you would want to do, and it evolved as you expected, or did it take you into new areas or ways you didn't expect?
Yeah, it was an entirely unplanned and organic process. So some of this kind of like, I did X and Y, like I organized it because I'm an organizer and a planner. It wasn't like that. These were just things that had kind of come to me or come through my experience of it. So this all started kind of, again, in the third week of March. I had a diagnosis by early July. So, there was a time period of getting various tests done. And I was adamant that I didn't have a problem. Of course, I'm not going to be sick. That's ridiculous. So it took me a while, to get in, to get the biopsy and all of that. And then I started treatment kind of late July, and I did 5.5 months of chemo through Thanksgiving week. Had surgery at December 31st, totally for insurance reasons, but it was also a nice way to wrap the year. And then early in the spring, I did radiation. And my practice was, first of all, it went deeper and deeper inward. And I think that's natural. This is hard. You get very tired. You're very inward focused. You need to kind of like, people, you're not going to be like conducting giant rituals for yourself. There are times where I'm just like sleeping 14 hours a night and still trying to work and still trying to stay on top of stuff. And, there's a limit to what you can do. So my magic focused inward, but it was also very organic because, so here's the thing that surprised me. I figured I would meditate through chemo. That seemed like a good idea. But what I was surprised by was that I met the chemo spirits. Like I actually met these entities. Which is why this is a grimoire, right? Because there's actually a poison spirit list in it, which were the chemo drugs that I had. In meditating during my chemo, I met and engaged with these spirits, and then I found myself needing to find ways to kind of harness them. And so it kind of had a Solomonic sort of vibe, in that these are not happy, friendly, nature spirits or pagan. These are like, they're harmful poison spirits. And, chemo it's barbaric, right? They're killing off all your fast growing cells in the hopes that they'll get the ones in the tumor before the rest of you falls to pieces. And so that's why your hair falls out, and, your stomach lining decides to abscond, and, you get nosebleeds and all of this kind of craziness. These side effects happen because they're poisons. And it became very clear to me that the whole infusion process was highly ritualized, which was something that surprised me. That's not something you can plan for. Nobody knows. And unless you're doing this, nobody knows what this is like. Nobody sits around thinking about chemo unless they're having chemo. And so I'm in there going, oh my God, there's ritual robes. They have to wear these special outfits, and there's this recitation of the name and the birthday kind of a thing, which is all to make sure that you get the correct drugs, but it's also like a ritual. Mm-hmm. What's super interesting to me is that since publishing the grimoire, I've been contacted by magically operant oncology professionals, people who give the chemo and who are like, yep, spirits. I didn't sense them exactly as clearly as you did because they weren't in my system, but yes, I can hold the different drugs and they have different, I can sense their different properties. They're like these entities.
Mm-hmm. I was actually curious about that, whether you had any contact with, like magically operant doctors of that nature. So that is very interesting to hear. And when you were having to go through this and you had met those spirits, just to take a step back, you mentioned the poison path, which, as like in witchcraft is a term that's used a lot, but could you just kind of like define what you mean by that and what the poison path and like that kind of working would be?
Well, I mean, there is a sort of history in witchcraft of like knowledge of poisons and having to, you can't heal unless you can harm. And in truth, poisons, a lot of medicines are poisons too. It's just a dosage issue, right? And so, and then there's this concept of like poison can be kind of an initiatory thing, right? You can take a substance and have it be an initiatory experience. And that was what I came to through this. These are clearly poisons and they're clearly entities. And I became poisonous. And I mean that like literally. My medical oncologist was like, okay, so for 2 days after chemo, your body fluids are a biohazard. If you were to throw up or something, you need to clean it with bleach and gloves. No sharing food, no sex. Not that I was, that really that energetic for the first few days after chemo anyway, but seriously, you're poisonous. You become the poison and the poison works through you. And these entities, the ones that I was engaging with, one of them was a derivative of mustard gas. So talk about an actual poison, right? That's been used as a chemical warfare agent. Also became used as this, class of chemotherapy drugs. Or the Taxol, which is from the Pacific Yew, which is associated with Hecate, which is a poison tree, and has this huge long, on the European side, this huge long folklore around being poisonous, and being associated with death and resurrection, and often planted, they're planted in churchyards, but it's actually the churchyards that we usually planted around these ancient yew trees. So,
yeah. And so they are, I think that is an important part, because our culture does not have a very, it's hard to even phrase it. We do not have a very healthy culture around the death and dying process. We have, we avoid talking about it, looking at it, thinking about it, because nobody wants to die, obviously. But at the same time, we don't, like, the way that we have learned to deal with those difficult things is perhaps not the healthiest of cultures. And in that same sense, it's kind of the poison, the poisons that we have to work with sometimes in order to be able to do good things, like save someone's life in the context where that poison can expel something from a body that is needed in order for the person to live. That is a positive side of it, but we are not very good at engaging with that, which I think is probably also an interesting mark that, like, most people would not think of chemotherapy drugs as spirits, because we are, when we think about modern medicine, not encouraged to think of it animistically. We are encouraged to think that it is a purely just separate, purely logically based thing that has nothing to do with spirits. But then if you're living in an animist world, there's nothing that isn't. So that was hence where my question was going to be, in terms of, did you sense that any of the doctors kind of knew that you were doing any kind of magic or witchcraft around this? Or did you sense that there were other people who kind of had done this in the past around those doctors or nurses?
So yeah, there were a couple experiences, and so clearly, oncology especially, and I refer to them as the oncological priesthood, right? Their knowledge is very deep in their specific area, but not very wide, right? And medicine is a field of specialties, right? And so there is a sort of sense that, what they're doing is the body is a machine and the machine is broken and they're fixing the machine, and it's not an animist worldview. But despite this sort of gulf in people's heads, and I think I had this too before I went through this process. Well, there's medicine, which is like, if you break your leg, yeah, sure, give me a cast, but that's not magic. And then there's magic, which is soul retrieval and spiritual healing and energy work and all that good stuff, which isn't medicine. And there's this gulf between them, and they don't touch. And that's just not the case. So first of all, I got an integrative medicine specialist. This is part of, because I live in a town with extremely good hospital systems that collaborate, and they're like, and that's your integrative medicine person. She had started the program here 12 years ago, and it took some time for her to get the oncologists on board. They would like say things like, we don't know what she does, but people who go to her do better. So go to her and do what she says. And what did she say? She gave me, supplements and herbs to try. She was very good on the diet advice. She was, she sent me to an acupuncturist who specialized in chemo patients, because you can't just go anywhere once you're going through this process, right? And pointed me to therapy and all these kinds of things that should be part of the whole, right? You should get those all as a package, but you kind of have to seek out some of the other pieces yourself. And even she couldn't go all the way to, I will connect you with a prayer circle or an intention group, or, I mean, there's only limits to how far she can go. So there is a bit of a practical divide, but from an animistic standpoint, there is no difference. And there were times when that came out, because I was keeping the kind of my magical stuff on the lowdown. I was kind of like, that's what I'm doing, but it's not something my oncologists need to know about. That said, I was trying to be engaged and positive with my doctors, because magically, if they like you and they want you to be well, then they're going to do a better job, right? So, for example, one of the chemo medications I get involves, they usually go in a little machine and they just get pumped into your system. But this one requires the nurse to sit there in front of you and do it. And it turns out, and I didn't know this at the time, it's because the drug is so very dangerous. And if something goes wrong, this is the red dragon that I talk about in the book. If something goes wrong, it could just eat through you. If you spill it, it will eat through your skin, which is crazy that I'm having this in my system. But she was sitting in front of me, and I was kind of meditating, and I was sort of putting my hand, and she kind of looked at me, and I said, I'm telling the medicine where to go. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't want it to destroy the rest of me. I wanted to go to the part of me that was troublesome and focus there. And she's like, that's so smart. She's like, I got to tell you, the people who do this, who participate in the process, who try to focus their healing on this stuff, do better. They have better results. And that was really rare that someone could, that she could say that. The other example was my radiation oncologist. So I have a set of oncologists, right? This is the guy who was cooking me with the radiation. He was the most positive, kind, upbeat person. And his team, he was good to his patients. He was good to his staff. He was just this light. And he and I really connected. And he would say, I would meet with him weekly, right? I'd have to go every day for radiation. And I'd meet with him weekly. And he'd say, it's so great to see you. You're like a light in the office. And he was so kind. And it just felt like, in addition to this medical treatment, we were engaging on a human level in a really positive way. And after I was done with treatment, they sent me a card where they all wrote personal notes. Everyone in the office wrote a little personal note. Not just, I hope you're feeling better, but like literally, I hope your chickens are doing great, like stuff that we talked about. And so, in the midst of what can feel like an uncaring, machine broken system that we are sometimes confronted with when we have to deal with modern medicine, are all these people, some of whom are just healers who want to help people, lights who see that the people who engage in the treatment do better. And that's magnificent to be able to like touch that. Right. And then to be there in chemo and, I'd be praying the rosary under my blanket, to Mary, Empress of Hell, and I'd be doing all this working. I had a space to do that because they created this comfortable space where I had a warm blanket and I had soup and they were kind. And
Yeah. And when there is it's making space for that, both for our medical communities to make space for that, and more space and time for that for patients when it's possible, obviously. And then also then for people who, when we go to those doctors, we also have our own practices that we can take with us and we can adapt and be with in a good way. So I think that's really beautiful. It brings up something else that I wanted to kind of get your perspective on, because we've talked about like mindset a number of times now. And I mean, going through something like this, I can't imagine how incredibly difficult it is, because there's a very real chance that, you know, like you said, you could take the final turning instead of coming back. And I'm so happy that you did. And I know that there's so many other people that are, which is wonderful. But like, how did you, because I feel like that's one of the dangers with this, is that people can trap themselves into trying to not feel their feelings when something, and this doesn't necessarily have to be cancer, it's like anything that is happening that is difficult, that people can try to trap themselves into, well, I have to only feel positive emotions. I have to only, you know, be happy. And then that's also kind of like shunting away, you know, being genuinely scared or being genuinely upset or afraid. And like, how did you try to balance that? I don't know how that would be.
So one of the weird things around this diagnosis was that about a year before I was diagnosed, I had a kind of a very deep journey where I was engaging with this sort of like teacher figure, right? You know, and I remember even thinking, gosh, you're so stereotypical with the antlers and the feathers and the staff. And I'm just like, oh, brain, wow. But no, I was engaged with this teacher figure, and the teacher figure directed me to cough up a large black stone that was lodged in my chest. Mm-hmm. And he said, I have to get this thing out of me. And I in my journey, I coughed it up. And it was huge, of course, because it's a journey, and it was huge. It was very cathartic and emotional when it happened. And what I realized was, and I thought, well, that was great, I dealt with that. And then of course, just a year later, I actually have a stone in my chest that I have to try to get out. The thing about cancer is, of course, it's not an attack from without. It's something from inside of you that's gone awry. And one of the things I realized through this process was that part of that came from the fact that some of my emotions were not really available to me, right? And that means, you know, astrologically, psychologically, just the way I react to things in my life. And I would have a hard time feeling sad. And so so that's part of my healing, is working on that. In fact, that part of it might be harder than all the chemo, getting in touch with those feelings that I had been bottling up, right? Bottling up inside me until they made a black stone, except not in a blaming sort of way, but in a sort of this is how we need to process our emotions. And so one of the things I discovered was that there's a kind of an optimism that's like a surface thing. We put it on because because it's the right thing to do, because it's what people expect, because if we're not optimistic enough, then we die of cancer, right? Like there's this kind of like optimism, yay. But there's a sort of a deeper, real optimism that comes from acknowledging when you're sad, right? You acknowledge when things are tough, and you use that to be optimistic about when things are good. And it was like this powerful emotional lesson for me and healing for me that's gone way deeper than the whole cancer treatment thing, right? Which is really weird to say, right? To be like, so I had cancer treatment for a year, but let me tell you about my work with the Jungian therapist, because that's where the real stuff is. But that's how it is. I see clearly the value of being positive and optimistic, but only if it comes from that deep wellspring. Mm-hmm. When we just say, I don't want to think about a bad thing because the bad thing will happen, it's a surface optimism. That's not how this works. Mm-hmm. Instead, we need to find a place where we can take an optimism from the real facts of things, which sometimes are sad, which sometimes are unfair, inequitable, oppressive. which come from a place where bad stuff can happen even if you really don't want it to. I certainly wasn't sitting around thinking, it would be awesome, breast cancer, that would be great. No, of course not, right? At the same time, I was not in touch with all my feelings. And so from that standpoint, I have this sense now of like optimism is this incredibly powerful, deep magic. It's not a surface thing. It's something you can connect with and use to change the way you live your life and thereby change your life. It's incredible. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it comes out of this wellspring of sadness that I hadn't expressed to myself, or, I had just sort of swallowed, I hadn't acknowledged, that's amazing. That's like alchemy right there.
Absolutely. Sounds exactly like, yeah, incredible alchemy. And I think that, yeah, there are a lot of ways that we can say that we're just doing, framing for ourselves or reframing something. And that's very valuable. That surface level can be valuable, but it's still only window dressing if it isn't part of the larger process of what's happening underneath and inside. So I think that's really important to bring up so that all layers are being addressed, not just like I'll put a smile on my face or say nice things. And that's, it's a lot more than that. We're talking about, kind of like deeper emotions and working with things that are difficult. You mentioned in the Cancer Grimoire that when you were working with these poison spirits, with these, chemo drugs, these spirits had sort of like advice for you on what you had to eat or not eat, that there was like fasting advice that came with it. Can you explain that to people? And also, like magically, were there other things that you found? I can't imagine how you felt. I'm sure you were extremely sick around the chemo treatments, but were there things that you had to do in order to sort of like work with those spirits? Is there anything you can share on that? Or?
So obviously, with the caveat that this is a super individual process, which is why you can't tell somebody else what to do with their process. You can't tell them what decisions to make. You can't tell them how to proceed through it. It's like an individual path. But what I found fascinating is that the chemo spirits are hard on your body, and they do sort of dictate what you can and can't do. So it's not like they said, like the grimoires are like, do not eat beans before you conjure this Solomonic spirit. It's not like that. They don't go, oh, don't eat beans. They go, you shouldn't have eaten that, and now you're going to be sick. They're very brutal that way. And nausea is a huge part of having chemo in general, and certainly the poison spirits are very directive that way. One of the things that I put up as sort of evidence of how well magic worked in this process for me is that I gained 10 pounds through chemo, which is ridiculous. Like all the doctors were like, you've gained 10 pounds. I'm like, I kept going to the doctor because you go all the time, right? They're always weighing you because they want to make sure you don't lose too much weight because chemo makes you very, very nauseous. And I'm all like, oh my God, I'm getting really pudgy. And they're like, it's fine. Most people lose a ton of weight. And I didn't. And it was in part because I was listening to the spirits sort of tell me what to eat. Mm-hmm. And when to eat and how to eat, but also because my husband, who's a magician, is also a chef. And so he was making me foods that were kind of magical. Plus the integrative medicine lady, she had a lot of advice around diet. She was talking to me about, the benefits of bone broth in terms of when you can't eat much, what you eat has to be really important. And there is evidence. So the interesting thing around fasting was there is evidence that fasting, to the degree that you become like autophagic, you start to strip away toxins, can be helpful with cancer treatment. And I fasted when I first got diagnosed, but the chemo spirits won't let you do that too much. They're like, well, you will eat, but you'll eat what we tell you to eat. And if you try to eat something else, it won't go well if you get sick. The other messages I sort of got were around being aware of my body. This is a really sort of powerful lesson. So I talk a little bit in the book about the nocebo effect. which for those who don't know is the opposite of the placebo effect. So a person in a white coat and a stethoscope gives you a sugar pill and says, this will cure what ails you. Well, in fact, it does. And research, like there's broad swaths of research that show this is a real thing. And of course, from my point of view, this is just magic. But there's the reverse too, which is that if the same person in the white coat with the stethoscope says, that's going to make you sick, then guess what? It does. And so for me, not knowing about all the side effects while focusing on what my body was really doing, like inward focus on my physical systems, was really beneficial. Because if someone tried to tell me side effects, sometimes I would get those side effects, which really annoyed me. I'm like, don't tell me what the bad stuff that could happen. I don't want to know, because I just want to kind of feel what I'm feeling and deal with that in the moment. And so there's this very much sort of a present focus to probably dealing with any crisis, right? But dealing with these spirits was very much about what I was feeling. The other thing is that they bring on, obviously they bring on physical symptoms and unpleasantness, but they also bring on this really dark night of the soul kind of things where you're faced with the idea of your mortality. You're faced with really thinking about, you're right that our society does a terrible job with acknowledging death, with rituals around death. We're very avoidant. At the same time, it's one thing to be a witch and be like, I'm much more comfortable with death. Well, that really gets called into question when you're sick in a way that kills people, because then suddenly you're going, well, maybe I'm kind of comfy with death, but I kind of don't actually want to die. And so there was kind of a lot of like deep exploration. And so it was as if the poison spirit sent some other spirits to me, right? That I had to cope with.
Yes. And I think, having understanding that the spirits, when we say spirits speak to us, that can mean a lot of different things. And that is, like you said, being aware of your body and actually being in what is happening to you and listening to that and being aware of it. And that is spirit speaking to you. It's not like necessarily a spirit speaking at your bedside, but it is many different forms of information that we get. And one of the things you also touch on in the grimoire, which for people, of course, people need to go and read it, but you talk about the descent of Inanna and how you used and worked with that myth as something that was very helpful to you in going through this process. And I've always been fascinated with that myth as well, which I'm sure many people listening have been as well. It's something that's a very powerful journey that a goddess goes through. Although I will just mention as an aside, like sometimes in the more neo-pagan world, I'm a little bit not pleased when sometimes people kind of look at that myth as like, oh, we could do that as an open ritual. No, Descent of Inanna is a very serious and dark myth that involves the stripping down of many things. But in this context, it seems to have been extremely helpful to you and just a beautiful thing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the descent and how that was for you while you were going through this.
So I've long been sort of a fan of Inanna, right? And some years back, I was trying to do some work with Inanna, and I felt at the time, a little bit like sometimes when if you're a pagan, right, and you reach out to a particular deity, sometimes the deity is like, yeah, let's work together. And sometimes they're like, thanks so much for calling. Our Lady of Largest Heart is not available at this time. We're sending you an autographed photo. Thank you for your interest. Like, you just don't get kind of like, they're like famous people, right? Like if you send Oprah a fan letter, she might not show up at your door, right? She might just be like, that was nice, thanks. And that's where it was with Inanna. Like, I was invoking and she was kind of like, nice to talk with you, great, thanks. And but I knew her rituals. I have the book of poetry from Enheduanna, her high priest, one of the first poets and the first books of poetry about a deity that exist for us, right, from a very long time ago. And when I began chemo and they were like, your hair's going to fall out, and I'm like, maybe it won't, and they're like, no, your hair's going to fall out. I mean, that's actually everybody, this the kind of treatment I had. Not every cancer patient's hair fall out, but like when you have breast cancer, your hair falls out. It's just a thing. So that was actually really emotionally hard for me because I had extremely long hair. And it was kind of a big part of my identity. And my identity is a witch, which is really, really interesting, right? And so I was struggling with that. And then I remembered the journey of Inanna, and she loses her crown, she loses her clothes, her jewelry. She's literally getting stripped down to nothing. And I suddenly realized that there was some real power in that narrative for me. And I have a much closer connection with her now as a goddess than I did before, right? I needed something, and I think there was, so I could access that. I would definitely recommend anyone going through a health crisis to try to find a narrative that they can cling to, because it was this concept of having things stripped away from me, which felt like that was the connection to the descent to the underworld. So yeah, because during my chemo, I mean, yes, my hair fell out, and then all my hair fell out. And at the worst of it, and I don't have a photo because it was that weird for me. I had no eyebrows and I had no eyelashes, and I had like one eyelash, and I had no hair anywhere on me, and it was weird. And then my mucus, your mucous membranes in general get stripped away from you. So I was having like chronic nosebleeds and just kind of like unpleasant symptoms, and your stomach doesn't operate so great anymore, and your digestive system's all messed up. There's just this stripping away of all these things. And I was using the descent as kind of mile markers for me. And I would read the poem and other devotional poetry to her while I was in chemo, right? Especially like at the front during the pre-medication process. They give you all these pre-meds so you don't get quite so sick. I have no idea what it'd be like if they didn't do that. And then you get the medicine, which is where I would do the prayers to the spirits. All of this process wasn't something I planned. It was just something that sort of came together piece by piece because I was just struggling to find a way to relate magically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and there are so many, like you said, it's not just the descent of Inanna. There are a lot of different, depending on your background, your belief systems, how you frame this stuff, and what your religion and your faith is. There are these stories. That is something that, thank the gods, these stories are there because they are true and they are needed and they are with us in many different ways. So I think that's really important for people to look at them and find something to help. And then to have, like you said, like then there was a space, there was a way that you could have that with you while you were going through it, which wasn't planned, but which just evolved because of your connection to those stories, which is beautiful. So in this Cancer Grimoire, you present information about what your process was and what some of the spirits were that you worked with, which happened to be, the drugs and the process that your situation called for. You said that you envision people to sort of like, take this and work with it and add to it. And you have mentioned like that this could be, ideally this could be, and I think you have it in the beginning section of the book, as basically a framing where ultimately we could have a system of medicine where these things are there for people and we build on it, and somebody who goes to a doctor can be referred to a prayer group or the other pieces of the magical puzzle and the medical puzzle all together. And you said that some people have already reached out. I was just curious, how has that already been? Because now this has been in the world, not for a very long time, but.
So it's been really, it's actually been surprisingly huge for me. I mean, it's been downloaded hundreds and hundreds of times, which is stunning for me. Like 600-700 people have downloaded it, and I'm hoping they're sharing it and passing around and using it to help each other get through medical crisis. I've heard back from people saying, this is so helpful with something that's not even cancer, but that is a medical thing. Mm-hmm. I'm having folks who are on the other side who are like, they're witches, like a witch who's also does the infusions, and I've asked her to contribute. She's going to. We had a nice chat, and I've asked her if she might contribute, probably under a pseudonym, of course, because she's in the medical field, to the grimoire, so she could add like the other context of what it's like to give these drugs and some of the and because there was stuff that going on that I was unaware of, right? Because I don't see that side of it. And I'm hoping, so I only had 3 chemo drugs, right? But there's dozens and dozens of them. So I'm hoping if other people, maybe who are magicians, go through this process and connect with other spirits, they can add them back to the spirit list. And slowly we can build this into because that's what grimoires are, right? They're like, in the olden days, they're like these working notebooks of magicians. They share spells with each other, which is why you have like 8 versions of whatever key of whatever, and they're all slightly different, and they've been translated in different languages. And I just want this to go out and do that. At the same time, there is a section at the beginning that I've asked that everyone keep in, and it's kind of my prayer for a better future in medicine, which is really about a kind of a medicine that you don't have to choose to do the herb or do the chemo, but that like things can kind of come together holistically, and we can pick what the best tools are for someone to be well, which would have spiritual and emotional and community and dietary components, and also the medicine to get somebody through a trauma or an illness safely. And it's interesting because I saw this in action with, of all things, my neighbors. So I mentioned at the start of this that we'd kind of like crazily decided we're going to sell our house and move, and then COVID, and then cancer, and somehow it all still came together. And I'll never doubt that we moved to the right place, because my neighbor, my back neighbor, when I met him, I saw him when we saw the house, kind of waved, he had cancer, and it had come up because he lost an arm. And it came up, and he said, by the way, I had cancer, and that's why. And then when I got my diagnosis, I had told nobody. I hadn't told my parents. I hadn't told anybody. I ended up telling my neighbor almost before anybody else, because I was like, I can't talk to you when you're talking about having cancer and not let you know that I have cancer. Right? It was just like, I'm like, but his situation was, the first time he had chemo, the second time he had immunotherapy, because they were developing an immunotherapy course for this kind of cancer that he had between, in the first time he participated in the study. The second time they had something different. And immunotherapy is basically teaching your own immune system. How magical is this? Teaching your own immune system to deal with the cancer cells, right? As opposed to poisoning them with these very harsh chemicals, right? Which are spirits, but also just very nasty for people, very hard on your system. So yeah, we need a future where kind of like the science and the ancient wisdom kind of come together and help people, because we have there's so much cancer. And it's not just because we're living longer. Statistically, we have more environmental poisons, and we're not living right, and therefore we have more cancer.
Yeah. And this way of partnering and looking at these things, I think it's important for everyone to see this, because especially what you have at the beginning there is that vision of what it could be like if we had these things partnered together and we had appropriate ways of helping each other, so that we could, have wider networks of connected help, so that it's not like segmented and presented to us in little chunks, and then a piece can get lost or not offered, and we don't even know it's missing because it's not part of that web. And it should be, and it really can be. And I think this is incredible what you've been able to start through what you've shared, and it's an incredibly deeply personal thing. So I'm very grateful that you were called to share that, even though that must be, difficult to do. And I'm so glad you have shared it with the world.
Thank you.
Is there anything else about this process that you want to kind of leave people with, or anything in particular that you want to guide people to think with around health and healing, especially right now?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would love to share is, so if you're ill and you have cancer, then certainly magic can help you. And I definitely, recommend, collect prayers, do magic, get your supports in place. But wouldn't it be better not to have cancer? And so I wanted to share this book called Anti-Cancer. My integrative medicine lady told me about it toward the end of our engagement together. And I kind of wish she told me about it earlier, like 10 years ago. It was written by an actual MD. He was a psychiatrist of all things, named David Servan-Schreiber. And it's called Anti-Cancer, A New Way of Life. And so the backstory is he was a doctor and he was a psychiatrist. He was doing like this very theoretical high level research. Turned out and then he ended up getting diagnosed with this fat brain tumor. And he began to explore what else he could do. So he was very much entrenched in the modern medical system. Of course, he had the best oncologists and he was getting all the treatments, but he started exploring what else he could do to, one, to do better, but then also to keep it from coming back, to keep from getting cancer. And Anti-Cancer is an amazing book filled with supplements and dietary advice and the power of regular breathing, whether that's Buddhist meditation or just breathing deeply on your own, like around globally. And it's just got a ton of great stuff in it. And so I just like to recommend it because I think if you follow the advice in the book, you will reduce your chances of getting cancer. And I appreciate that nobody thinks they're going to get cancer. I'm never going to get cancer. It's nuts. Like I never would have thought. But I just wanted to share it out there because it's good stuff. It's and it's also perfect for all your materialist friends who don't get the magic part of it because it's all the science research, the stuff that oncologists don't have the time to read, the nutrition and the anti-inflammation stuff and the whole foods pieces and the breathing pieces are all stuff that, we don't have an integrated system. So you have to hunt this stuff down on your own. So I just wanted to share it out there because I think it's good stuff. And it's certainly something that I'm taking into my practice, into my life, because I don't want to do this again.
Yeah, well, I will definitely put the information for that book in the show notes. So if people didn't catch the name while they were listening, it will be there. And I'm gonna throw the Power of 8 and Lynn McTaggart down there as well, because I feel like that always means, it's always appropriate and is a part of this. So Ivy, I can't thank you enough for being on and talking to us about this. I just want people to recap. circlethrice.com is the place to find you. Is there anything else that you want to tell people about where to find you? Or is that
really? I mean, I tweet or whatever, but honestly, my website is kind of the starting point for all my offerings, most of which are totally like free, and the Cancer Grimoire is totally free and will always be totally free. I think that's really, really critical. So please take a copy, share it widely, add to it if you like, right? And pass it along to others. And then, check my blog out. I've got writings. I have a newsletter, again, all kind of free stuff. So I just, I love, and, if anything in the grimoire resonates with you, if you are engaged in fighting cancer, either as a patient or as kind of like a medical provider, if you're in the process of dealing with this yourself, feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. It's been amazing, the stories people have been sending me. It's stunning. So I love it. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having me on as well. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Ivy. And we will talk again sometime, I hope.
Yeah, please. I'm sure we will.
It was very powerful to speak with Ivy about her journey, and I'm so grateful to her for sharing with the world her story through conversations like the one we just had, and of course through the grimoire that she has written and shared. Coming to further, deeper awareness of the inspirited world we live in is obviously a lifelong journey for all of us, and I agree with Ivy that our culture's relationship to modern medicine and healing is in need of some re-enchanting. Of acknowledging the many forms of ritual and magic that are already intrinsic to healthcare and healing, so that we can live our lives in the most holistic ways possible. And that does not mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater or ignoring or losing what is miraculous and wonderful about modern healthcare, but also looking at it from an inspirited, empowered lens, so that we can widen the field of what's possible and seek out the best ways for us to be mentally, spiritually, and physically healthy. As always, links to what we talked about are in the show notes. I really encourage you to check out those links. And as always, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing. And check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. May we all be blessed with good health and well-being for our journeys ahead. And I will see you next time.